الحمد لله رب العالمين وبه نستعين ونصلي ونسلم على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما يا رب العالمين. So moving on, before we begin the exact text, like after the muqaddimah, we'll go through just the table of contents or the way Sahib Uṣūl al-Shāshī has ordered the discussions in his work. If you guys remember, I mentioned that one of the things that makes Uṣūl al-Shāshī different a little bit is that he did follow the tartib or taqsim ruba'i, yani the idea of categorizing all the mabahith into four and then those four into four, like that overall has been followed. But at the same time, he changed the tartib as well slightly, or we find different now, whether he changed it or whether he found in some other book this tartib that he based it off of, Allahu A'lam, but we do find a difference in his tartib compared to the tartib that's found in normal books. So because of that, it's important to specify the differences. So starting, he begins with the Wujūh al-Waḍዕ, just like so the mabahith of Kitābullāh, when they start with the mabahith of Kitābullāh, normally Ḥanafī books, we mentioned that there's four categories: Wujūh al-Waḍዕ, then they have Wujūh al-Bayān, then Wujūh al-Istiʿmāl, then Wujūh al-Istidlāl. Right? So just to recap, we have Wujūh al-Waḍዕ, then Wujūh al-Bayān, in terms of clarity, then Wujūh al-Istiʿmāl, how the word can possibly be used, then you have Wujūh al-Istidlāl, how you extract meanings from the words. طيب. From this perspective, he starts off with Wujūh al-Waḍዕ. And he begins with, so Wujūh al-Waḍዕ are four. We mentioned this in a previous lesson: Khas, Am, Mushtarak, and Mu'awwal. So he starts off with Faslun fil Khasi wal Am, and then he mentions, interestingly, right after that, he mentions Mutlaq and Muqayyad. So this is interesting. Why? Because technically, yes, Mutlaq and Muqayyad technically are discussions that relate to Khas and Am, or it's the same thought process that is applied in Khas and Am by the Hanafiya. That same thought process is applied in Mutlaq and Muqayyad. That is true. However, usually the Hanafi books, they mention Mutlaq and Muqayyad later on. Why? Because the emphasis over there, the specification that occurs over there is towards the idea that doing hamal of the mutlaq upon the muqayyad, that is incorrect. That is what the Shafi'iyya do. They do hamal of the mutlaq upon muqayyad, and we're going to mention the surah when it comes, not every scenario, but more than the Hanafis. They do it in certain scenarios. Hamal of mutlaq upon muqayyad. Now, in Manār al-Anwār, after mentioning all of the wujūh, so Wujūh al-Waḍዕ, Wujūh al-Bayān, Wujūh al-Istiʿmāl, Wujūh al-Istidlāl, then he mentions certain istidlalat fasida, incorrect istidlalat. Over there he mentions mutlaq and muqayyad. So in Manār al-Anwār it is mu'akhar, whereas in Uṣūl al-Shāshī he brought it forward right after Khas and Am. So between Khas and Am he brings mutlaq and muqayyad, then he brings mushtarak and mu'awwal. طيب. What's even more interesting is that in the examples of mutlaq and muqayyad, he's bringing a lot of examples of not that which is mutlaq and muqayyad, rather examples of ziyada al-nas. Now, ziyada al-nas is not a discussion he talks about, but he brings examples like that. And the reason for this is, we can say, Wallahu A'lam, as a philosophy or as an ideology, it's the same methodology, the same process that is being applied in all of them. Khas and Am, the same thought process goes to Mutlaq and Muqayyad, the same thought process goes to Ziyadat al-Nas. Not being a Ziyada al-Nas la yajuz in al-Hanafiyya, مثلا. It's the same thought process. But the way he's bringing the mabahith is, again, for the purpose of extreme brevity or ikhtisar. And so, by bringing examples of Ziyada al-Nas, you can say he's giving ishara that, okay, Mutlaq and Muqayyad, you get the idea over there and you also apply that same idea over here and understand that by way of the examples. Wallahu a'lam. This is if we want to make sense of how he does it. Otherwise, the only other option is that you just say that the examples were brought for Ziyada al-Nas, even though he's talking about Mutlaq and Muqayyad, and we're not sure why he brought those examples. طيب. So anyhow, this fasl of Mutlaq and Muqayyad is mu'akhar in the in the Sahib al-Manār. طيب. Then he brings فصل في المشترك والمؤول. فصل في المشترك والمؤول. So this is the وجوه الوضع, right? الوضع that he starts off with. After al-Waḍዕ, he has فصل في الحقيقة والمجاز. طيب, this is وجوه الاستعمال. So interestingly, instead of bringing secondly وجوه البيان, he flips number 2 and number 3. So in normal books, what's mentioned after وجوه الوضع is وجوه البيان. In Uṣūl al-Shāshī, what's mentioned after وجوه الوضع is وجوه al-Istiʿmāl. So he goes straight into حقيقة, مجاز, and صريح and كناية. Then after that, he brings وجوه البيان. وجوه البيان, he calls it فصل في المتقابلات. فصل, which is also an interesting name, because usually the Hanafis don't call this فصل في المتقابلات. They mention that this is a taqsim depending on or based on the clarity of the word in implying a certain meaning. But he brings it as فصل في المتقابلات, and over here he mentions the 4 categories that are opposite of 4. So you have ظاهر and nas and mufassar and muhkam, and then on the opposite end you have khafi and mujmal and mutashabih. Naam. So these are فصل في نعم, these are فصل في المتقابلات. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. طيب, after this he has an interesting فصل, which is فصل فيما يترك به حقائق الألفاظ. Now this is a really interesting فصل. Why? Because this is not مذكور in Manār. This exact فصل is غير مذكور في المنار. It's an extra فصل that was added. However, it's also interesting because the better place to add this would be right after حقيقة and majaz, right? Because this is regarding حقيقة. Like, when do you leave حقيقة and resort to a majazi معنى? That's really what the discussion is. فيما يترك به حقائق الألفاظ. In what scenarios do we leave the حقيقة and go elsewhere? So this is a nice فصل, and it's an additional, benefit, good information. But the place he mentioned it was after وجوه البيان. So bring فصل في المتقابلات first, and then mention فصل فيما يترك به حقائق الألفاظ, which is really interesting as well. It would be better if he brought this right after فصل في الحقيقة والمجاز. Then he has فصل في متعلقات النصوص, and this is وجوه الاستدلال. So he finishes off with وجوه الاستدلال in the end. So he flips 2 and 3, and then he finishes off with وجوه الاستدلال. طيب, then he brings فصل في الأمر والنهي. طيب, this is really interesting. So al-amru wal-nahyu is actually one of the main discussions of khas. One of the main discussions under khas is al-amru wal-nahyu. And in Manār, right after he explains khas, he goes straight into amr. And all of the discussions regarding the awamir and nawahi are mentioned over there. So a lot of discussions regarding the whole mabhath of amr, the whole mabhath of nahi is mentioned ضمنا in part of the mabhath of khas. طيب. Like in Sahib Uṣūl al-Shāshī, he doesn't mention فصل في الأمر والنهي over there. He actually mentions it later. So there's a lot of what's happening over here is that there are interesting mabahith, but the order, like if you develop, like for example, you understand the concept of khas, it's better right after you understand the concept, let's now talk about amr, because amr is from khas, and let's talk about all the extensive discussions regarding that. After you understand how haqiq and majaz works, let's just talk about فصل فيما يترك به حقائق الألفاظ. So you understand all of what pertains to that. But when you have it reordered or different places in the book, then sometimes the mind is not able to connect the dots. Like, okay, this is actually part of that discussion, this is actually part of that discussion. So it's important to go through this in the beginning so you understand the exact order that he's using. So yes, فصل في الأمر المطلق, فصل في مقتضى الأمر, فصل في المأمور به, فصل في حسن المأمور به, فصل في الأداء والقضاء, فصل في النهي. His فصل في النهي, now another interesting point, فصل في النهي is a lot smaller than فصل في الأمر. Why? Because a lot of discussions that are already mentioned in فصل في الأمر, the opposite of it is already understood to be the case when it comes to nahi. What's the further discussions that are needed, which are only specific to nawahi, that is what he brings in فصل في النهي. So again, اختصار شديد. طيب. Then he has فصل في تعريف طريق المراد بالنصوص. Now, this also is not mentioned in Manār al-Anwār. Then he has فصل في تقرير حروف المعاني. Now, this should be حروف. Okay. What's interesting is this discussion. Normally in the books they mention it right after حقيقة مجاز as well. Right after حقيقة مجاز. Why? Because this is an extension of majaz. So حروف have حقيقي معاني and حروف have majazi معاني. And in this entire discussion, what they bring, which is really a borrowed discussion from Nahw and from Arabic, from stuff that has to do with the Arabic language, literally a borrowed discussion from that ilm, but it has to do with how the fact that huruf carrying different meanings can influence ahkam. And the beauty of the Hanafi madrasa is over here in this discussion, they bring a lot of furu'. Furu' meaning they'll show you very subtle differences, for example. Like for example, they'll mention that if someone were to say to his wife, for example, "Anti taliqun in kharajti illa bi-idhni," that you're divorced if you exit or if you leave the home except with my permission. And he uses the word illa bi-idhni with a ba. Just to give you guys an idea. If you just change this and if you say "Anti taliq in kharajti illa an adhana lak," you change the ba and you replace it with an adhana lak. In the first one, which is if you were to say illa bi-idhni, then whenever she would exit, she would need his permission. In the second one, if he says illa an adhan lak, it's only the first time after he said this, when she exits, she needs his permission. After that, she can exit without his permission. So these very, very subtle differences that are taking place because of just the letters that are being used. So it's a very nice, beautiful understanding of how impactful the Arabic language is when it comes to how it influences ahkam. And on top of that, the depth of how they were looking at literally the letters, to the extent of the letters, to make sure that, what are the implications of this letter, what are the implications of this letter, what are the implications of this harf, what are the implications of this harf, and how does that influence ahkam, and whatnot. So it's a really interesting mabhath, although it's not something which is so maybe practical today, because again, this is in a society where people are speaking Arabic, and then on top of that, urf has a big role in this. Like, if people don't know Fusha anymore, and they don't even know how the language works anymore, then would you apply the same level of precision, for example? Maybe not, maybe yes. So this can change depending on where you are and so on and so forth. And especially, for example, if you're speaking in English, then the rulings would change. But we would use the same concept, right? We would look at the words and we would really think, okay, what do these words imply? And it becomes a long discussion from there. But at the point is that it's very beautiful how intricate they were. So normally they bring this fasl right after fasl fil haqiqati wal majaz. Why? Because it's an idea that shows that huruf can be used in haqiqi ma'ani, and they can also be used in majazi ma'ani. But he delayed this as well, this entire discussion. Then he mentions faslun fi wujuh al-Bayān. This is also very nice fasl that is normally mentioned in the Hanafi works. It's interesting because the concept of bayan will have occurred many times before. So the discussion of bayan is being repeated in all of these previous discussions. Like, for example, لا يحتمل البيان, like, right, a word which is khas, لا يحتمل البيان. What does that mean? What does لا يحتمل البيان mean? They haven't explained to you as of yet what bayan means until all the way later. Then they tell you there's different types of bayan. So there's bayan al-tafsir, bayan al-taghyir, bayan al-darura, bayan al-hal, bayan al-atf, bayan al-tabdil. And now really it gives you an understanding, okay, how do we understand bayan that came before? So again, this is a little bit of a problem, and this is why I would never suggest to study Uṣūl al-Shāshī right off the bat. You need to study a book in the beginning, and that book should create that ta'sil for you, or that level should create a degree of ta'sil for you, an understanding of how the ilm al-usul works. And then when you study Uṣūl al-Shāshī, like, you're not too caught up with these problems. The fact that the order is not necessarily right after, or the stuff is not exactly where you would expect it to be. It's like kind of all over the place. Now that can be problematic. Maybe the author was trying to make it as mukhtasar as possible, and he felt that he could change the order a little bit just to make it as extremely mukhtasar. That is also mumkin. Like, for example, like amr and nahi, like it's nice that he delayed this discussion, because it in of itself becomes such a long discussion. So imagine if you're going from khas to am, and right after you finish khas, before you get to am, because even though a lot of discussions regarding am are very connected to khas, but you go straight into amr and nahi, and then over there you could take a long tangent, and imagine you're spending 3 weeks just studying amr and nahi, and then you come back to am, and then you're like, wait, what does it have to do with khas again, or what does it have to do with what was mentioned before, and a little bit confusion. So it's possible like he delayed it for that purpose, just so that you keep in mind the main discussion. Wallahu a'lam. Lakin tartib is an ijtihadi matter. It's not like something which is like set in stone, but it's important to keep in mind where it's normally not in line with the same tartib as the normal Hanafi works. Then he goes into al-mabhath al-thani, which is sunnah, and after al-mabhath al-thani he has ijma', which I didn't mention, but it's pretty straightforward. Sunnah, then ijma', then qiyas. Like, the discussions regarding sunnah as well in Uṣūl al-Shāshī are very limited. Like, he doesn't go into extreme discussions. A lot of discussions very mukhtasar. And qiyas is also very mukhtasar. So qiyas is extremely mukhtasar. The whole discussion regarding qiyas and how qiyas works in Usul Shāshī, very mukhtasar, extremely mukhtasar. طيب. On top of that, after qiyas, normally in the books, in the Hanafi books, they have discussions as well, such as discussions regarding awarid, really important discussion. They have discussions regarding ahliya, the types of ahliya, and so on and so forth. All of these discussions are left out in Usul Shāshī. So he doesn't talk about extensively regarding ahliya. He doesn't talk about awarid. Like, it seems as if towards the end of the book, he tried to finish it off very quickly. Like, wallahu alam, like the way the book is written, like in the beginning, he was going to a little bit more detail. It was still as a mukhtasar, but it still was a little bit more, covering all the discussions. But as the book goes on, then especially when you get to after the discussion regarding Kitābullāh, when you get to Sunnah and Ijmā' and Qiyas, you just see quick, finish as soon as possible. So it's ending very quickly. In fact, I think maybe 3/4 of the book is just the mabahith regarding Kitābullāh, or maybe 60% of the book, 60 to 70% of the book is only regarding Kitābullāh. The rest of it would be Sunnah, Ijmā' and Qiyas all together. And again, like I said, the more you go in, like qiyas is very mukhtasar, and then he just dropped off a lot of discussions that are meant to be held in the end that he didn't have in this work. Now, in our initial lesson, in the initial level, the first level in Hanafi Usul that we did, we mentioned a lot of these discussions. So after qiyas, we mentioned a number of discussions, not everything, because again, that was also first level. Like, there was a number of discussions that were added. Even in qiyas, we added some discussions. So I wouldn't even be surprised if qiyas, the examples in Usul Shāshī gives more examples. So we weren't mentioning a lot of examples, but we were focusing on making sure that the discussions were mentioned. طيب. Moving on, he says al-Baḥth al-Awwal. So that is the table of contents, and it's important to keep that in mind, inshallah ta'ala, when we're going through the book. I'll reference this again, and I'll also throughout the book, inshallah ta'ala, whenever there's differences between some of the other works, we'll mention it as well, inshallah ta'ala. Because again, we mentioned that we want to make this as critical a study as possible. طبعا, this is not a naqd upon the musannif. Don't misunderstand, ahbab. I don't want anyone to think that we're doing naqd upon the musannif. La, these are ijtihadi matters. Like, how you order the book, that is not something which is set in stone. It's not like one person got it right and one person got it wrong. There's pros and cons to each method. Like I mentioned, like, it makes sense for him to delay amr, because if you bring amr before into khas, then it really does make you kind of derail and go on to a tangent, which is a very long tangent. It's not a small tangent. So it kind of does get you to lose focus regarding how khas connects with am and so on and so forth. There's other things as well that we're going to mention, inshallah, as we go through the book. There's a lot of discussions that he just doesn't mention altogether. Now, because it's a mukhtasar. So it being a mukhtasar makes sense. A lot of times he brings, like, sometimes you might think he's bringing questionable examples, but by bringing those examples, he might actually be giving ishara towards the fact, or like something he gave tarjih to based on what normally is found in the mutawwalat, which is debated, right? He might be giving you an idea that, okay, I'm giving preference to this. Now, again, he's like, for example, if you go through if you're compiling a mas'ala, discussion, and you want to make it mukhtasar, as concise as possible, and then you go into the mutawwalat and you see there's a little bit of debate back and forth. Which version are you going to put in the end in your mukhtasar? The version you feel is strong, that occurred between this back and forth. Like, they're going to mention the back and forth happens, they mention the proofs, they mention the arguments. And so in the end, though, when you put it in the mukhtasar, you're not going to put both opinions and then all the proofs, because at that point it becomes mutawwal. You're going to put the opinion you felt was stronger and maybe give a little bit of ishara towards the reason why you felt it was stronger, and you move on. So this is very similar to what Sahib Usul Shāshī does. He won't actually take you into the entire discussion. He won't tell you that, okay, the Hanafiya differed, or the books, for example, sometimes there's differences regarding these matters. Sometimes some examples are contended. He might bring the example. Sometimes he might bring an example just because he knows this example can lead to another point, another example which is important. Instead of bringing just a basic example of the mas'ala, he brings a contended example, because that contended example has another interesting discussion that can be found within it. So he, like, you always want to keep in mind that this is a mukhtasar at the end of the day, and you want to study it as if it is a mukhtasar, keeping in mind all of what mukhtasarat entail. طيب, he says البحث الأول في كتاب الله تعالى, then فصل في الخاص والعام. طيب, before we go to فصل في الخاص والعام, what is Kitābullāh? What is the definition of Kitābullāh? So we say The definition of Kitābullāh هو القرآن المنزل على رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم المكتوب في المصاحف المنقول عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم نقلا متواترا بلا شبهة. This is the definition of Kitābullāh. طيب. Number one, هو القرآن المنزل على رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. By mentioning المنزل على رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم, okay, we are removing all of the kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala which was revealed upon anyone other than the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam from the prophets. So even the previous prophets, they received the kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Qur'an can also be just the kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So for this reason, when we say Qur'an, what are we referring to? So really, this is the definition of Qur'an as well. Kitābullāh, meaning Qur'an as well. What's the definition? It is the kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala which was revealed upon the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. طيب. The kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is more than what is in the Qur'an. The actual Qur'an that we have, or was the final book that was revealed to the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the actual kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is more than it. It's not just this. Why? Because the Torah also is the kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Injil is also the kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Zabur is also the kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And beyond even the books that were revealed upon prophets, there could be kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala which wasn't revealed. It's not necessary that all of the, in fact, the kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beyond 100% what was specifically revealed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Like for example, the Messenger says that we praise Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, أنت كما أثنيت على نفسك لا نحصي ثناء عليك أنت كما أثنيت على نفسك, that we're not able to praise you the way you deserve to be praised, the way you praised yourself. Meaning Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala praised himself. Now obviously that's also from the kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Like, and it wasn't revealed. That's why the Messenger is saying we praise you that way, the way you praise yourself. But we don't even know what that method is. Like, so the actual kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beyond what was revealed. And then what was revealed, it's mutabayin. Yani what was revealed upon the Messenger is not the same as what was revealed upon Isa. Yes, there's overlap. So there's concepts that are overlapping. No doubt in that. There's even some ahkam, commandments that overlap. But at the end, it's not entirely, in its entirety, it's not the same kalam as what was revealed upon Isa and it's not the same kalam as what was revealed upon Musa. So by adding al-Munazzal ala Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, we're removing all of the kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the other types of the kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. طيب. Then he says al-Maktubu fil Masāḥif. طيب. If you just stop at al-Munazzal ala Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, then you have a problem. Why? Because what was revealed upon the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wasallam, meaning revelation, is actually of two types. There's al-Wahyu al-Matlu and al-Wahyu ghayru al-Matlu. And all of them are munazzal. All of it is being revealed upon the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Allah says, وَمَا يَنْطِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيٌ يُوحَىٰ. So even the statements of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which are not actually Qur'an, which you recite, the tilawah of which is done as an ibadah, even though they're not actually Qur'an, it is still considered ish. It's still considered munazzal ala Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So even the ahadith are munazzal ala Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Even the ahadith are munazzal ala Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So by adding al-Maktubu fil Masāḥif, we're removing all forms of wahi which is ghayr matlu. All forms of wahi which is ghayr matlu. طيب. Then he says, al-Manqūlu عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم نقلا متواترا بلا شبهة. But it being written down in the Masāḥif is not enough. On top of that, it has to be transmitted from the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam generation upon generation, naqlan mutawatiran bila shubha, by way of a mass transmission. Now, what is the definition of tawatur? For those that have studied usul hadith, or even in the previous level, we mentioned the definition of tawatur, which is that in each generation there are so many people that are transmitting it. It's mass transmission, that it's impossible to assume that they all got together and they conspired to lie. So it can never be a lie by way of them intentionally conspiring to lie. And neither can it be a coincidence where they accidentally all transmitted the same wrong information. طيب. One misunderstanding though is that when we say naqlan mutawatiran, we're not necessarily referring to asanid. This is a misunderstanding. When this concept of tawatur was extended over to ilm al-hadith, in ilm al-hadith they have this discussion because there were some muhaddithun that claimed that the actual ahadith mutawatir are very few. Because if you think about it, if we're saying tawatur is in each generation, there's so many people narrating it where, massive numbers, and they could not possibly have conspired or possibly together lied accidentally. Now, if you want to search that up, what would you do? You would go look at the asanid. You go look at the chains. You get a narration. Let's find all the chains that it's been narrated with. So in the time of the Sahaba, how many were narrating? In the time of the Tabi'un, how many were narrating? In the time of Atba'u Tabi'in, how many are narrating? And so on and so forth. That's what you're looking for. But that's obviously a limited amount. You're not going to find so many chains. So the actual ahadith that you find so many chains regarding, they're limited. Majority of ahadith, you're not going to find crazy amounts of chains. But this is actually, so that led some muhadithun to saying that the idea of tawatur in hadith is rare. Then there were other muhadithun that came and, made a rebuttal, or they responded to that. This is a long discussion that's mentioned in al-Hadith. But this is actually a misunderstanding regarding the concept of tawatur that we're actually looking for. So when we say tawatur, you have to understand that this discussion of tawatur is actually taken from the books of Uṣūl al-Fiqh and Uṣūl al-Din. That is initially where this discussion is mentioned. And the first ones that brought this discussion or the idea of tawatur to the books were it came through the ulum of Uṣūl al-Din and Uṣūl al-Fiqh, the Uṣūliyun. Specifically because the Uṣūliyun were muta'athir, they were affected by Aristotelian logic and so on and so forth. And in their discussions, they've mentioned the concept of tawatur and how tawatur is a method of relaying information in a definitive sense, where the person who the information is being relayed to must 100% accept that information. But when you look at the examples they would mention of tawatur, and this really clarifies for us what they really meant by tawatur, because again, tawatur is misunderstood. What they really meant by tawatur, when you look at the examples they give of tawatur, they say that our knowledge regarding distant lands and our knowledge regarding kings that existed long time ago, this is an example of tawatur. Like, what is the literal definition of tawatur? The literal definition of tawatur is tatabu', meaning one after the other, a little bit after a little bit. So the example would be that, let's say you're living back in the days, not today. Today, for example, we have access, you have cameras, you have videos, you have so many different ways to achieve information regarding what's happening on the other side of the globe. But let's say long time ago, before there were cameras, before any of this existed, you're living in a small little village in the Arabian Peninsula, for example. And there's people, like let's say you're living in Mecca, for example. Now, not everyone in Mecca was able to travel. A lot of Meccans, they were born in Mecca, raised in Mecca, and they died in Mecca. A lot of villagers were like that. They never ever left their village. There were a few people that would go for trade, and when they would go for trade, everyone would give whatever they had into their caravan so that those people could go and represent everyone and sell, and they would come back and distribute amongst everyone. That's how the Quraysh used to engage in trade. That's how they actually lived. Allah says, لِإِلَى فِي قُرَيْشِ إِلَى فِيهِمْ رِحْلَةَ الشِّتَاءِ وَالصَّيْفِ. So the Quraysh in the winter once and in the summer once, they would send a caravan up north, up to Sham, caravan which was led by very specific individuals, the main Qurashiyun, the leaders of Quraysh, and they would go and they would do the trade and they would come back. But not everyone in Mecca left Mecca. The majority of the people, they would be born in Mecca, raised in Mecca, and they would die in Mecca without ever having left Mecca, because traveling was not easy. Traveling required itself, number one, that you have a lot of you're able to take care of yourself, you have wealth, and you have a ride, and so on and so forth. So traveling was not common. It wasn't that easy. So let's say you're in Mecca and there's a caravan that goes, and they come back and they tell you that, we went to a land called, went to Sham. And then they start describing how Sham is, right? They tell you, okay, what, as soon as you enter the city, there's an amazing, massive structure or building that just to your right, as soon as you enter the city, the first thing you see is this, the gates of the city. As soon as you enter the gates, that's the first thing you see. And then they tell you more regarding the city and so on and so forth. Like, that happens. There's one caravan that goes, come back, they tell you this. Then after a little while, there's somebody else that goes and travels, and he also goes, the next caravan, for example, they also go to Sham, and they come back and tell you the same thing. As soon as you enter through the gate, you're going to see a massive building on the right. That's the first thing you see. And then a third caravan, the same thing. A fourth caravan, the same thing. A fifth, to the point that it occurs so much that you have no doubt in your mind, like it grants you definitive knowledge that 100% as soon as you enter the gates, there's a massive building to the right. Okay, and they all also describe the building. So this is the concept of tawatur, the idea that there's tatabu' of information. Now over here, were you memorizing the chains? No, you weren't. You don't remember who told you what they told you. And likewise, you we're not focused on the chains. The chains don't matter over here. We don't look at you're not looking at the narrators. Are they trustworthy? Are they not trustworthy? Just the fact that the information is continuously being repeated to the point that this repetition causes you to have definitive knowledge and lose all doubt that this could actually be the case just by sheer repetition. Like, also in tawatur, you're not looking at the words. Like, one guy comes and tells you, oh, it's a massive building. The other guy comes and tells you a very large building. Another person comes and tells you there's a structure that is, oversized. Another person comes and tells you, like, they use different words. They don't have to use the same word, but the idea is the same. This is also tawatur. So in tawatur, there's a few things that in the real concept of tawatur, which was mentioned in the books of Usul, this is the examples they're giving. There's a few things which they're not really picky about. They're not picky about the words that are being used. It's more about concepts, like concepts being related. They're also not picky about the idea of, do you actually know the chains or not? They don't really care whether you know the chains or not. They're also not picky about the fact that the narrators that are relaying it, are they trustworthy or not? It's just the fact that sheer repetition of information being relayed to you is enough. Waḍḥ. This is the example of tawatur they give in their works. Now, when we say the Qur'an was preserved by way of tawatur, are we trying to say that every single harf that you find in the qira'at, or every single version that they normally say are mutawatir, you're going to literally find so many chains for each one of these huruf in the books written down? The answer is no. That's not what we mean by that. We don't mean by the Qur'an being transmitted by way of tawatur this. What we mean by the Qur'an being transmitted by way of tawatur is that right now, for example, in Ramadan, every Ramadan you go to the masjid, and what happens? They finish the entire Qur'an. A lot of times you go to masajid, what do you see in the masajid? You see a number of halaqat, a number of classes, and they're just memorizing the Qur'an. Like this, what you see right now, the way the Qur'an is being transmitted and preserved by people are memorizing, teachers are teaching, students are learning. They're always reciting it. In every Ramadan, they're finishing the Qur'an once in the masjid. This is exactly what was happening in the time of the Sahaba radiallahu anhu ajma'in. Like literally, the same exact thing was happening in the time of the Sahaba radiallahu anhu ajma'in. So in the time of the Sahaba, they used Umar radiallahu anhu gathered them upon one Imam in Taraweeh, and they used to finish the Qur'an every single Ramadan. And they had halaqat, every masjid across the globe. They had halaqat teaching people the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, where the Sahaba went out as teachers and they had disciples and they would teach them the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this occurred generation upon generation until now. Now in the process, sometime in between, they started writing stuff down too. But it wasn't something which from the day one they were always writing everything down. That wasn't needed. But it was a relaying of information, a relaying of recitation, a teaching of such recitation. So when you had this effect that took place, but when you correspond and you try and find like literally written every single chain for every single harf, you might not find tawatur in every single chain for every single harf. But that was never the point. Like you missed the point. If this is what we're thinking tawatur means when it comes to the Quran, this is a misunderstanding of the concept of tawatur when it comes to the Quran. This is really important. Because a lot of people that go around go like, oh, the qira'at are not all mutawatir. Which yes, we know even the qira'at ashara, Ibn al-Jazari rahimahullah ta'ala, for example, he clarified and he said that the condition is not tawatur, the condition is sihhatu sanad. Because when he started looking at the asani, he realized that not all of the ahruf are, there's ahruf yasira that are not actually mutawatir, even in the qira'at ashara. Does that mean anything? No, it doesn't. They're not mutawatir from the perspective of the chains, or if you look at it from the perspective of the understanding of tawatur that the muhaddithun are mentioning, which is literally, every single harf you have a chain that's going up and you're looking at all the rijal and they're all trustworthy. This type of tawatur, yes, no, that doesn't exist. But is that the meaning of tawatur to begin with? That's really where it's important to keep this in mind. So he says, أن منقول عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم نقلا متواترا. The Quran not only is a maktub fil masahif, what was written down in the masahif in the time of Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu was the skeletal form. The skeletal form. What is the skeletal form? That's the rasm. Rasm means without dots and without harakat. So normally when you look at for example, if you open the Quran, for example, you'll see, let's look at a verse, إن جاءكم فاسق بنبأ فتبينوا. إن جاءكم فاسق بنبأ فتبينوا. Okay. Now, what you see over here is two things. You have harakat and you have the dots. So the harakat are the vowels, right? And then you have the nuqat, the dots. Like fa has a dot on top of it, jim has a dot underneath it, nun has a dot inside, right? Qaf, two dots on top, okay, so on and so forth. The skeletal form is the form of writing without both of these. So fatabayyanu, the skeletal form of this is, that's it. That's the skeletal form. Okay. This is how the Quran was initially written down. And this is how the Arabs used to write Arabic. That's not just the Quran. The Arabic was written down like this. Okay. Now, this is really important. Someone goes like, okay, wait, that could be read in so many different ways, which is true. It could be read in so many different ways. So, fatabayyanu, fatathabbatu literally has the same exact skeletal form. Nanshur, nunshir, nunshiz has the same exact skeletal form. There's no difference in the skeletal form. Like in the actual rasm. Because you remove all the dots. Remove the dots and remove the harakat. So someone could say, wait, they could make, like, this could be read in so many different ways. So how do we know how to recite the Quran? So we see the Quran was never a written tradition aslan. It was an oral tradition. The way the Sahaba were teaching their disciples and the way the Messenger taught his disciples who were the companions was not that he brought to them a book and he said, look, read this book. It was never like that. When Jibreel came to the Messenger and he said, Iqra, the Messenger said, Ma ana biqari. He said, I'm not reading. I don't know how to read. And the second time he said, Iqra, he said, Ma ana biqari. Some scholars say he was, instead of the second time meaning, I don't know how to read, he actually intended, what do I read? And where's the written, where is it? What am I supposed to be reading? So it wasn't that the Quran was never meant to be a written tradition. It was not a written, it was an oral tradition. The Messenger recited upon the companions and the companions remembered it. Just like Jibreel recited upon the Messenger, or he received wahi and he remembered it. He never repeated the words. He never, لا تحرك به لسانك لتعجل به إن علينا جمعه وقرآنه فإذا قرأناه فاتبع قرآنه. Okay, recite it upon the people. That's your job, O Muhammad. He just recites it upon the people. And they remember it. And then they recite it upon their students. So the Quran was never meant to be a written tradition. It wasn't a written tradition. It was an oral tradition. It was an oral tradition. Now, because it was an oral tradition, the masahif that came later, they were just meant to be reference points. What was the real, the actual i'timad in the Quran, in the naql of the Quran, was upon memorization, hifz. They would remember it and they would recite it, and then they received it as a recitation, they recited it and passed it on as a recitation. Yes, in the process they also wrote. They wrote, but that writing was meant to assist with the memorization and what was being passed on with an oral tradition. So see, right now, you might not know that this is fatathabbatu or fatabayyanu. But if I give you this and then I read it to you, right, the right way. طبعا fatathabbatu, fatabayyanu are both correct qira'at, but I'm just giving an example. If I read it to you as fatabayyanu, right, I give it to you, when I initially give it to you, it's all just hakada, the skeletal form. But when I read it to you, I read it to you a certain way. Now you know this is how it's meant to be read. And that's how you remember it. So whenever you see those words, you actually remember it the way it's meant to be read. Okay. And then when you pass it on the same way that you received it. So this is the way the Quran was taught. And al-an, so it's possible though. It's possible that there might be some variations that you can still, using the skeletal form, create. Now, could that be allowed, that any variation you can create or any renderation you can create, as long as it falls in line with the skeletal form, that you can recite it that way? The answer is no. This is wahi. So the way the Messenger taught the companions pass it on forward. And in that process of passing on, there were some methods that were being passed on by way of tawatur. This was the condition for it being a Quran, that it was being passed down by way of tawatur. Then he says bila shubha. Why does he say bila shubha? Because some of the early Ahnaf would divide tawatur into tawatur bil-shubha and tawatur bila shubha. What is tawatur bil-shubha? Tawatur bil-shubha is the one where in the initial phase, in the time of the Sahaba, it wasn't mutawatir. But then it gained shuhra in the time of within the Qurun Mufaddala. So in the second generation and third generation, that is where it gained shuhra. And by way of gaining shuhra, it became mutawatir. This is tawatur bil-shubha. Tawatur bila shubha is the tawatur that is from the very beginning. It's being passed down in such a massive form from the very beginning and taught to everyone. طيب. So he says al-manqulu an-nabi al-maktubu fil masahif, that kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, number one, which was revealed upon the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Number two, was written in the masahif to remove wahi ghayr matlu. Number three, what was written in the masahif, it was a skeletal form, and that could be read in different ways, but only those renderations or only those methods of reading that were transmitted generation upon generation by way of tawatur, and not tawatur sanadan. We're not looking for a sanad over here. We're looking for the practice, generational teaching of it. By way of tawatur, bila shubha, this started from the time of the Messenger. He taught many companions, they taught many of their disciples, and so on and so forth. It was passed down from the time of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wa alihi wasallam. So when we say naql mutawatir, okay, it will remove all of those qira'at that are found in ahadith that are considered ahad. Like for example, the qira'ah of Ubay radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, فَعِدَّةٌ مِّنْ أَيَّامٍ أُخْرَ مُتَتَابِعَاتٍ. This word, mutatabi'at. Like, this is not in the skeletal form aslan, but he used to teach, or he did read at a time like this. نعم. طيب. And then when he says بلا شبهة, this is removing هذه القراءة. نعم. إذ المشهور آحاد الأصل متواتر الفرع. What is مشهور? That which is آحاد الأصل, يعني in the first generation is خبر واحد, and then it becomes متواتر. Some said it is one of the types of tawatur, and the Ahnaf normally treat mashhur. They normally treat mashhur as they would treat tawatur in terms of its hukum. In a lot of discussions that's going to come inshallah ta'ala, you'll find them that they use it as it is mutawatir. Like, this is the definition of Kitābullāh. Kalāmullāh al-munazzal ala Rasulihi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, al-maktubu fil masahif, al-manqulu an nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, naqlan mutawatiran bila shubha. طيب, in the next lesson inshallah ta'ala we'll continue with the first chapter in the mabhath of Kitābullāh, which is faslun fil Khāṣī wal 'ām. And again, why faslun fil Khāṣī wal 'ām? Because we start off with Wujūh al-Waḍʿ. Like Wujūh al-Waḍʿ. Now even this, the Sahib al-Shāshī doesn't mention these titles, right? But this is what it is. Wujūh al-Waḍʿ is 4 types: Khās, 'ām, Mushtarak, Mu'awwal. He only mentions faslun fil Khāṣī wal 'ām. He doesn't mention this is Wujūh al-Waḍʿ, then I'm going to Wujūh al-Bayān, then I'm going. It's different terms that he's using. So this is really interesting as well. The fact that he's using different terminology for these different categorizations, that is not really the common terminology that's found in the Ḥanafī works. So he starts off with faslun fil Khāṣī wal 'ām. We'll continue this inshallah ta'ala in the next lesson. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.